She thought the oversized thrift store sweaters and the constant laundry duty were enough. Nora had survived 5 months in a cartel boss's house without a scratch, but hiding a second trimester bump from the city's most paranoid man was a losing game. Then, a single, folded square of glossy paper slipped from her coat pocket onto his mahogany desk. An ultrasound. Dominic didn't just stare at the grainy black and white image. He looked up at her. And then he locked the door. The kitchen island was imported marble, cold enough to draw the heat right out of Nora's forearms as she leaned against it. She shifted her weight from her left foot to her right. The dull, rhythmic ache in her lower back flared, a quiet reminder that her body was no longer entirely her own. 5 months. She pulled the thick, cable-knit cardigan tighter around her torso, burying her hands in the stretched-out pockets. It was late April, and the sun glaring through the bulletproof floor-to-ceiling windows of the compound promised spring. But Nora was dressed for a blizzard. She had claimed a faulty thyroid made her run cold. Nobody questioned the help, especially not the men with holstered Glocks who paced the perimeter of the estate. They just wanted coffee, and they wanted it strong. Nora, a small, high-pitched voice, echoed from the carpeted hallway. Lily came skidding into the kitchen, her socks sliding on the polished hardwood. She was 4 years old, a tiny, chaotic force of nature in a house built on silence and fear. "I'm here, Bug," Nora said, forcing the strain out of her voice. She pushed off the counter and knelt, careful to keep her knees wide, angling her body so her stomach was obscured by the drape of her sweater. Lily crashed into her, throwing 2 small arms around Nora's neck. Nora caught her, absorbing the impact with a soft grunt. The child smelled of lavender shampoo and the expensive organic crayons scattered across the playroom floor. Nora buried her face in Lily's dark curls, closing her eyes for a fraction of a second. This was the job. This was the only reason she was still in this fortress, breathing recycled air and jumping at shadows. "Dad is home," Lily whispered, pulling back. Her dark eyes, so violently identical to her father's, were wide. Nora's pulse skipped, a cold dread washing down the back of her neck. "Is he?" Before Lily could nod, the heavy oak door of the foyer shut with a muffled, definitive thud. Footsteps followed. Not the heavy, hurried boots of the guards, but the measured, deliberate tread of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Dominic Russo walked into the kitchen. He didn't look like the romanticized gangsters on television. There were no tailored suits today, no slicked-back hair. He wore a dark Henley, stained at the collar with something Nora refused to look at too closely, and dark denim. His knuckles were split. The skin over his left cheekbone was an ugly, mottled purple. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by whatever ugly business he had been conducting for the past 3 days. Nora stood up slowly, keeping Lily in front of her like a small, unwitting shield. She crossed her arms over her chest, bunching the thick wool of her sweater. Dominic's eyes scanned the room. They were pale, slate-grey, and utterly devoid of warmth. They ticked over the stove, the exits, the shadows in the corners, before finally landing on Nora. "Is she fed?" Dominic asked. His voice was a low rasp, like tires on gravel. He didn't say hello. He never did. "Chicken and vegetables an hour ago," Nora replied. Her voice was steady. It had to be. Weakness in this house was a liability, and Dominic excised liabilities with surgical precision. He nodded once, walking toward the sink. He turned on the faucet, shoving his bruised hands under the cold water. The water running down the drain turned a faint, rusty pink. Nora looked away, focusing on the back of his neck. The tension in his shoulders was wound tight, the muscles corded and stiff. 4.5 months ago, those same hands had been gentle. It was a stupid, cynical memory that Nora fought down daily. A night when the compound had been under lockdown, when a rival faction had driven a truck through the front gates. They had been trapped in the safe room for 12 hours. Lily had been asleep. Dominic had been bleeding from a gash on his shoulder, and Nora had patched him up. The adrenaline, the suffocating fear, the sudden, sharp realization that they were two human beings breathing in the dark. It had boiled over. It was a mechanical, desperate collision of bodies. No words, no promises. Just a brief, violent grasp at being alive. The next morning, the bodies were cleared from the lawn, and Dominic was back to being a ghost in his own home. He never mentioned it. Neither did she, until her period was late, until the nausea hit, until the reality of carrying the heir to a criminal empire settled in her gut like a stone. "You look pale," Dominic's voice snapped her back to the present. He had turned off the water and was drying his hands on a towel. He was looking at her. Really looking at her. Nora swallowed the dryness in her throat. "I'm fine, just tired. Lily had a lot of energy today." Dominic stepped closer. The kitchen suddenly felt microscopic. He smelled of rain, copper, and cold exhaust. He tilted his head, his grey eyes narrowing slightly as they dragged down her form. The oversized sweater hid the curve of her stomach, but it couldn't hide the fullness in her face, the heavy, exhausted slope of her shoulders. "You've been wearing that tent for a month," he noted, his tone flat, unreadable. "I run cold, Mr. Russo," she said, keeping her chin level. He stared at her for 3 long seconds. In Dominic's world, 3 seconds was enough time to decide if a man lived or died. Nora held her breath, praying the baby wouldn't choose this exact moment to kick against her ribs. "Take the weekend off," he finally said, tossing the towel onto the counter. "You look like you're going to pass out. I don't need a medical emergency in my house. I have enough to deal with." "I don't need time off," Nora said quickly. Leaving the compound meant drawing attention to her movements. "It wasn't a suggestion," Dominic replied, turning his back to her. He crouched down to Lily's level, his entire demeanor softening by a fraction of a millimeter. He tapped her nose. "Be good for Maria this weekend, Bug." He stood up and walked out without another look at Nora. Nora exhaled, a shaky, pathetic sound. She pressed a hand flat against her heavy stomach, beneath the wool. He didn't know, but he was looking. And Dominic Russo never missed anything for long. Saturday morning in the clinic felt entirely disconnected from the reality of the Russo estate. The waiting room smelled of industrial bleach and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the lemon polish and ozone of Dominic's fortress. Nora sat on a hard plastic chair, staring at the muted morning news on a small television mounted in the corner. She had taken 2 buses and a taxi, paying entirely in cash, leaving her phone back at the compound. Dominic tracked the staff's phones. He called it a security protocol. Nora called it a leash. Nora Hayes, a nurse in faded blue scrubs, stood at the doorway. Nora stood, her joints protesting the movement. She followed the nurse down a linoleum hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry hornets. "Step on the scale, please." Nora shed her heavy coat, feeling exposed in just a t-shirt and jeans. The number on the digital display made her chest tighten. She was gaining exactly the amount she was supposed to. It was healthy. It was normal. It was a death sentence. 15 minutes later, she was lying on an examination table, the cold gel smeared across her swollen belly. Dr. Aris, a tired woman with graying hair who didn't ask questions about why Nora paid in cash, moved the wand over her skin. "There," Dr. Aris said, turning the monitor toward Nora. Nora stopped breathing. It wasn't just a blur of static anymore. There was a spine. There was a tiny, perfectly formed profile. A hand, curled into a fist near its face. The rhythmic whoosh, whoosh, whoosh of the heartbeat filled the small room, drowning out the buzzing lights, drowning out the cynical voice in Nora's head that told her she was a fool for keeping it. Heart rate is strong. 150 beats per minute, Dr. Aris noted, typing something into the keyboard. Growth is right on track for 21 weeks. Do you want to know the sex? No, Nora choked out. The tears were hot and sudden, burning her eyes. Knowing the sex made it too real. It gave the child an identity. Right now, it was just a secret. If it became a boy or a girl, it became a person Dominic Russo could take from her. All right, Dr. Aris said gently. She hit a button on the machine, and a small printer whirred to life. She tore off a strip of glossy paper and handed it to Nora. A souvenir. Nora shouldn't have taken it. It was physical evidence. It was a loose thread. But her fingers closed around the paper anyway, her thumb brushing over the image of the tiny, sleeping profile. She slid it into the inside pocket of her wool coat. Just for today. She would burn it tonight. By the time Nora returned to the compound, the sky had bruised into a deep, stormy purple. The front gate guards patted down her grocery bags. She had bought mundane things as an alibi. Tampons, cheap magazines, a specific brand of tea. She walked through the heavy front doors, the silence of the house pressing in on her immediately. She towed off her boots and started down the hall toward her ground-floor bedroom. You were gone a long time. Nora froze. The voice came from the shadows of the formal living room. Dominic stepped into the dim light of the hallway. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, his face an unreadable mask. I had errands, Nora said, keeping her hands out of her coat pockets. The buses run slow on weekends. My head of security said you left your phone in your room, Dominic said. He took a slow sip of his drink. The clinking of the ice against the glass was deafening. You know the protocol, Nora. Nobody leaves without a tracker. I forgot it on my nightstand. It was an accident. Dominic stepped closer. The predatory grace of his movements made Nora's muscles lock. He stopped a foot away from her. He was close enough that she could see the faint stubble along his jawline, the dark circles under his eyes. You've been erratic, he said softly. It wasn't a word of concern. It was an accusation. You're exhausted. You're dressing in layers when it's 70 degrees outside. You're leaving the property off the grid. I told you I had my men pull the street cameras near the bus stop you got off at, Dominic interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. Her stomach plummeted. You went to a clinic on 4th Street, Dominic stated. He tilted his head, his eyes boring into hers, dissecting her panic. A cash-only place. Not the kind of place a woman goes for a common cold. And you certainly wouldn't need to hide a cold from me. Nora's mind spun violently. She needed a lie, a good one. I have a mass. Dominic's jaw clenched. The muscle feathered near his ear. A mass. A tumor, she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. In my abdomen. It's benign, they think, but it's growing. I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to lose my job. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Dominic stared at her, searching her face for the telltale signs of a lie. Nora forced herself not to blink, not to look away. She channeled every ounce of terror she felt about the baby into the lie about the tumor. For a moment, something flickered in Dominic's cold eyes. Something that looked like a jagged, uncomfortable splinter of empathy. You thought I would fire you because you're sick, he said flatly. You aren't exactly known for your charity, Mr. Russo. He studied her for another long moment, then drained the rest of his glass. I'll have my private physician look at you tomorrow. If you need surgery, I'll cover it. You don't go to back alley clinics while you live under my roof. No, Nora said, too loudly. No, I'm handling it. I have a doctor I trust. Dominic's eyes narrowed again. Suspicion, sharp and lethal, flooded back into his posture. "You don't dictate terms to me, Nora. My doctor sees you tomorrow. Go to your room." He turned and walked toward his office at the end of the hall. Nora stood frozen, her hand instinctively coming up to rest over her coat pocket, over the ultrasound. Tomorrow. She had until tomorrow before his doctor exposed her lie, before the mass in her abdomen was revealed to have a heartbeat. The storm broke over the compound just after midnight. Thunder rattled the bulletproof glass, vibrating through the floorboards of Nora's bedroom. She hadn't slept. She couldn't. Her suitcase was open on the bed. It was small, a cheap duffel she had brought with her 6 months ago. She was packing methodically, logically, 3 pairs of pants, her warmest sweaters, all the cash she had managed to siphon from her paychecks, hidden in rolled-up socks. She had to run. There was no alternative. When Dominic's doctor found the baby tomorrow, the lie would collapse. Dominic wasn't a man who allowed things that belonged to him to exist outside of his control. A child? His child. He would lock her in this fortress forever, or worse, take the baby the moment it took its first breath and discard the vessel that carried it. He was a monster who loved his daughter. Yes, but Nora was nothing to him. A mistake made in a locked, safe room. She zipped the bag shut. The house was dead quiet, save for the rain. The night shift guards patrolled the perimeter outside, but inside, the hallways were clear until 5 a.m. Nora pulled on her boots and grabbed her heavy wool coat from the back of the chair. She slid her arms into the sleeves, pulling it tight. She grabbed the duffel bag and eased her bedroom door open. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows. She moved quietly, her thick socks silencing her footsteps. She bypassed the kitchen and headed toward the side door near the laundry room, an exit she knew had a slight delay on its magnetic lock. If she timed it right, she could slip through and clear the fence near the woods before the system registered the breach. She was 10 feet from the door when the lights snapped on. Blindness hit her for a second, a harsh, stinging white light. Nora gasped, dropping her bag. Dominic was sitting in a leather armchair in the alcove near the laundry room. He wasn't wearing a shirt, just sweatpants. A holstered gun rested on the side table next to him. He looked like a statue carved out of granite, entirely unmoving, his cold eyes fixed on her duffel bag. "Running," he said. It wasn't a question. Nora couldn't speak. Her throat closed up. The panicked thumping of her heart was so loud, she thought he might hear it across the room. "I had the security system altered 2 hours ago," Dominic continued, his voice dangerously calm, "to alert my personal monitor if your door opened. I had a feeling the tumor story was bullshit." He stood up. The sheer size of him, the latent violence radiating off his frame, paralyzed her. "Who are you selling to?" he asked, stepping toward her. "What?" Nora breathed, taking a step back. "The clinic," Dominic said, his jaw tight. "Was it a drop? Who did you meet? The Morettis? The Irish?" "No, Dominic, no, I'm not a spy." "Then why are you sneaking out like a thief in the night?" he roared, the sudden explosion of sound making Nora flinch violently. "You tell me you have a tumor, then you pack a bag at 2 a.m. You think I'm a fucking idiot?" He crossed the distance between them in 2 massive strides. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip like iron vices. He slammed her back against the wall, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. "What's in the coat, Nora?" he demanded, his face inches from hers. "You've been guarding those pockets since you got back. You got a flash drive in there? Bank numbers? Let me go." Nora shoved at his chest, panic taking over completely. She fought him, thrashing wildly, terrified of the pressure against her stomach. "Don't touch me, let me go." Her sudden, frantic resistance caught him off guard. He grabbed her wrists, pinning them to the wall beside her head. In the struggle, the heavy wool coat flapped open. "Stop fighting me," he snarled, dropping one of her wrists to reach into her left pocket. He found nothing. He reached across her body, his hand plunging into the inside breast pocket of her coat. His fingers caught the edge of the glossy paper. He ripped it out. Nora stopped fighting. Her entire body went slack against the wall, the fight draining out of her, leaving nothing but cold, absolute terror. Dominic stepped back, releasing her other wrist. He didn't look at her. He looked at the folded paper in his hand. He smoothed it out with his thumb, holding it up to the harsh overhead light. The silence in the hallway was absolute. Even the rain seemed to stop. Dominic stood perfectly still. His eyes scanned the black and white static. They moved to the tiny spine, the curled fist, the printed text at the top. Hayes, Nora. Gestational age, 20 hulawatisan bubabiyaham forda. He didn't yell, he didn't move. For a terrifying minute, he just stared at the paper. When he finally looked up at Nora, the cold, calculating kingpin was gone. The man looking at her was pale, his grey eyes blown wide, his breathing suddenly shallow. His gaze dropped slowly from her face, down to her waist. He stared at the thick, bunched wool of her sweater, the sweater she had used to hide the curve of a child that was half his. "Nora," he whispered. It was the first time she had ever heard his voice shake. "What is this?" The hallway lighting, harsh and unforgiving, cast long shadows against the walls. The silence between them was a physical weight, pressing the oxygen out of the corridor. Dominic looked from the crumpled ultrasound in his large hand to the oversized wool sweater Nora had used as armor for months. "Mine," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was a terrifying, absolute fact settling into the foundation of his reality. Nora's spine remained rigid against the wall. She wanted to lie. She wanted to scream that it was some random encounter at a bar, a mistake from her life before she took the job in his fortress. But lying to Dominic Russo was a fatal error, and they both knew the exact mathematics of her pregnancy. The lockdown, the safe room, the blood on his shoulder, and the suffocating darkness. "Yes," she choked out. The word tasted like copper. Dominic didn't move toward her. He didn't offer a hand, didn't pull her into an embrace. He simply stared, his mind visibly shifting gears, abandoning the threat of rival cartels and moles, and violently realigning to this new, staggering vulnerability. He looked down at the duffel bag resting by her boots. "You were leaving." His voice was hollow, stripped of the roaring fury from 60 seconds ago. "You would have taken it," Nora said, her voice shaking violently now that the adrenaline was crashing. "You would have taken the baby and thrown me out, or locked me in a basement. I know what you are, Dominic. I know how you handle liabilities." His jaw flexed. The muscle jumped beneath his bruised skin. "You think I would lock the mother of my child in a basement? I think you don't do attachments. I think you do acquisitions." Dominic carefully folded the ultrasound, slipping it into the pocket of his sweatpants. The casualness of the movement was jarring against the sheer intensity in his slate-grey eyes. He stepped forward, closing the distance. Nora shrank back, but there was nowhere left to go. He reached out, his split knuckles hovering inches from her shoulder before his hand dropped. He didn't touch her. "Pick up the bag," he ordered. The raspy gravel of his voice was back, clipped and authoritative. "Dominic, please." "Pick it up, Nora." She swallowed hard, bending down on trembling legs to grab the handles of the cheap canvas duffel. When she straightened, he was already walking down the hall, away from her staff quarters bedroom. "Follow me." She had no choice. She followed his broad back through the maze of the compound, past the locked security doors, past the formal dining room, and toward the east wing. The master wing. He stopped in front of a heavy oak door 2 doors down from his own suite. He unlocked it with a biometric scan and pushed it open. He hit the lights. It was a guest suite, but it rivaled a luxury penthouse. A king-sized bed dominated the room, flanked by heavy mahogany nightstands. The windows were reinforced glass, overlooking the high stone walls of the compound's rear garden. "Put your bag on the bed," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. Nora walked into the room, feeling like she was stepping into a cell lined with velvet. She dropped the bag. "Dr. Rossi will be here at 7, Dominic said, leaning his shoulder against the doorframe. He crossed his arms over his bare chest. "He will examine you. He will pull blood. We are going to find out exactly what condition you and the child are in, because a clinic that takes cash in an envelope is not touching my bloodline again." "I am perfectly healthy," Nora shot back, a flash of defensive anger cutting through her fear. "I did what I had to do to survive. You drank cheap tea and wore 3 layers of wool to hide my kid from me for 5 months, Dominic corrected, his tone dropping to a lethal calm. "Survival is what starts now, Nora. You don't leave this wing without my men. You don't eat anything my personal chef hasn't cleared. And you never, ever lie to me again." He didn't wait for a response. He pulled the heavy door shut. The definitive click of the electronic lock, engaging, echoed through the massive room. Nora stood in the center of the plush rug, alone. She pressed her hands to her stomach, finally pushing the heavy cardigan open. The pronounced, hard curve of her 21-week bump pressed against her thin cotton shirt. She let out a jagged sob, sinking to the edge of the mattress. The game was over. The hiding was done. She wasn't the nanny anymore. She was the vault, holding Dominic Russo's most dangerous secret. The next 3 weeks blurred into a suffocating routine of paranoid luxury. Dr. Rossi, a discreet man with expensive shoes and a briefcase full of portable medical tech, visited twice a week. He checked her blood pressure, monitored her iron levels, and gave Dominic detailed clinical reports in the hallway, while Nora sat on the edge of the examination table, feeling like a prized racehorse being evaluated for the track. The oversized sweaters were discarded. Dominic had sent a personal shopper to buy out an entire maternity boutique. Nora's closet was now filled with silk loungewear, cashmere wraps, and soft, tailored dresses that clung to the undeniable shape of her pregnancy. She hated them. They were comfortable, undeniably so, but they felt like a uniform. Her role with Lily had changed, yet remained strangely the same. Lily still came barreling into Nora's room every morning, demanding stories and coloring time. To the 4-year-old, the only difference was that Nora lived in the big rooms now and her stomach was getting round. "Is there a baby in there?" Lily had asked on the 4th day, poking Nora's stomach with a green crayon. Nora had frozen, glancing up to see Dominic standing in the doorway. He was always standing in doorways lately, watching. "Yes, Bug," Nora had said softly. "There's a baby." Lily had grinned, completely unbothered by the logistics. "Can it play with my cars?" "In a little while," Dominic had answered from the threshold, his voice softer than it ever was with anyone else. He had walked in, crouching beside his daughter, his eyes briefly meeting Nora's before dropping to her stomach. The look was heavy, loaded with a strange, possessive gravity that made Nora's skin prickle. That was the hardest part of the new arrangement. The proximity. Dominic was around. Before, he had been a phantom, a shadow that occasionally crossed the kitchen, a violent force that left blood on his collar and bruises on his knuckles. Now, he ate dinner with her and Lily at the long mahogany table. He sat in the armchair in her suite while she read to Lily. He was an inescapable gravitational pull in her daily life. It wasn't romantic. It was something far more primal and terrifying. It was observation. One evening in late May, the suffocating heat of the approaching summer seeped through the thick walls of the compound. Nora was in her suite, standing by the reinforced window. She wore a thin, black maternity dress that stretched tightly over her belly. The dull ache in her lower back had returned with a vengeance, radiating down her legs. She pressed the heel of her hand into the base of her spine, wincing. The door opened without a knock. Dominic walked in, holding a folder. He stopped when he saw her grimace. "Sit down," he ordered, tossing the folder onto the foot of the bed. "I'm fine," Nora sighed, continuing to knead her back. "It's just the weight shifting. Dr. Rossi said it's normal." Dominic ignored her protest. He walked up behind her. "I said, sit." She let out a frustrated breath and moved to the edge of the bed, perching on the mattress. She'd expected him to leave, to go back to whatever cartel business was in the folder. Instead, Dominic pulled the velvet armchair closer and sat down facing her. He reached forward and took hold of her left ankle. Nora flinched, trying to pull her leg back, but his grip was unyielding. "What are you doing?" "You're swelling," he noted flatly. He pushed her pant leg up a few inches, exposing her calf. His thumbs pressed firmly into the swollen tissue around her ankle. The pressure was intense, but almost immediately, the deep, throbbing ache began to recede. He didn't ask for permission. He simply worked his thumbs in slow, methodical circles, his face a mask of total concentration. "Dominic, you don't have to do this," Nora murmured, her face flushing hot. The intimacy of the gesture felt dangerous. It blurred the lines between captor and caregiver. "Rossi said, elevation and massage. You refuse to ask the staff for help, so I'll do it." He dropped her left leg and picked up the right, repeating the process. His large hands, rough with calluses and the ghosts of violence, were surprisingly precise. "I don't like being treated like a piece of glass," she admitted, staring at the top of his dark head. Dominic stopped. He looked up, his slate eyes locking onto hers. "You aren't glass, Nora. Glass shatters. You survived 5 months in this house, carrying my child and plotting an escape right under my nose. You're titanium, but even titanium buckles under too much weight." He let go of her leg and leaned back in the chair. He looked exhausted. The purple bruise on his cheekbone from a month ago had faded, but it had been replaced by dark, bruised exhaustion under his eyes. The syndicate was pressing him. Nora heard the muffled shouting from his office at night. She knew the territory disputes in the city were escalating. "Why did you keep it?" he asked suddenly. The question cracked the quiet of the room like a whip. Nora stiffened. She instinctively wrapped her arms around her stomach. "What? In this life?" "In my house," Dominic clarified, his voice quiet but sharp. "You knew what I was. You knew what finding out would mean. Why didn't you go to a clinic and get rid of it? You had the cash. You had the time." Nora looked away, staring at the heavy curtains. She thought about the static on the monitor, the rhythmic whoosh of the heartbeat, the desperate, overwhelming realization that despite the terror of its father, the child was hers. "Because it wasn't the baby's fault," Nora whispered, the truth stripped bare. "And because I thought I could outrun you." Dominic stared at her for a long time. A bitter, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Nobody outruns me, Nora," he said softly, "especially not with my blood in their veins." The illusion of safety shattered on a Tuesday. It started with a disruption in the perimeter cameras. Nora was in the kitchen, slicing apples for Lily, when the heavy steel shutters over the massive windows suddenly slammed down with a mechanized, terrifying screech. The kitchen plunged into artificial twilight, illuminated only by the under-cabinet lighting. Lily dropped her crayon, her eyes wide. Nora moved instantly, dropping the knife and scooping the child into her arms, pressing Lily's face into her neck. Booted footsteps pounded down the hallway. 3 guards in tactical gear rushed past the kitchen, weapons drawn, heading for the front foyer. "What's happening?" Nora shouted to the last guard. "Stay away from the doors, Miss Hayes. Boss's orders," the man barked, not breaking stride. Nora backed into the corner of the kitchen, putting the heavy marble island between them and the hallway. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the baby kicking violently in response to the surge of adrenaline flooding her system. 10 minutes passed. 10 minutes of muffled shouting, the screech of tires on the driveway outside, and the terrifying unknown. Finally, the kitchen door swung open. Dominic walked in. He was holding a suppressed handgun down by his side. His face was pale, his eyes entirely black. He looked like death walking. He holstered the weapon at the small of his back and crossed the kitchen in 3 strides. He didn't look at Lily. He grabbed Nora by the upper arm, his grip bruising. "We're going to my office, now." "Dominic, you're scaring her," Nora hissed, pulling back, nodding to Lily, who was trembling against Nora's shoulder. "Maria!" Dominic roared toward the hallway. The older housekeeper appeared seconds later, looking terrified. "Take Lily to the interior playroom. Do not leave her side." Nora set Lily down, kissing the top of her head. "Go with Maria, Bug. I'll be right back." As soon as Maria led the child away, Dominic yanked Nora down the hall, pulling her into his office and slamming the heavy oak door shut. He locked it and turned to face her, leaning heavily against the wood. "Who did you talk to at that clinic?" he demanded, his voice a lethal hiss. Nora rubbed her arm where he had grabbed her, her mind spinning. "No one. The receptionist, the doctor. That's it." Dominic pushed off the door, pacing behind his massive desk. He picked up a tablet and threw it across the room. It shattered against the stone fireplace. "You left a trail," he snarled, planting his hands flat on the desk, leaning toward her. "You took a cash taxi. You walked into a clinic that services half the low-level street dealers in this city. And you didn't think anyone would notice the nanny of the Russo syndicate waddling in." Panic seized Nora's throat. "I was careful. I wore a hat. I paid cash." "The Morettis have a guy on the payroll at that clinic," Dominic interrupted, his voice echoing in the cavernous office. "He pulls security footage to find out if rival dealers are patching up bullet wounds under the table. He saw you." Nora's knees went weak. She grabbed the back of a leather chair to steady herself. They know a woman from my household went in for an ultrasound," Dominic said, rubbing his hand over his face. He looked ragged, a man stretched to the absolute breaking point. "They don't know who the father is yet. But they aren't stupid, Nora. They know I don't let my staff breathe without my permission. They're going to put it together." "What did they do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Outside just now." "What happened?" "They left a message," Dominic replied. He looked away, staring at the shattered tablet on the floor. "They dropped a crib on the front driveway, covered in gasoline, and they lit it on fire." The room spun. The air in Nora's lungs turned to ice. A burning crib. It was a promise of violence, so visceral, so targeted, that it made her physically nauseous. She swayed, the edges of her vision darkening. "Nora." Dominic was around the desk in an instant. He caught her just as her knees gave out, his large arms wrapping around her torso, taking her full weight. He lowered her gently onto the leather sofa against the wall, sitting beside her and keeping one arm firmly around her shoulders. "Breathe," he ordered, though his own chest was heaving. "Look at me. Breathe." Nora gasped for air, her hands instinctively clutching her stomach. "They're going to kill us. They're going to kill the baby." "Nobody is touching you," Dominic vowed, the words vibrating in his chest. "I will burn this entire city to the bedrock before I let a Moretti step foot on this property. You hear me?" Nora looked up at him. The cynical, calculated monster she had feared for 5 months was gone. In his place was a man terrified of losing the one thing he didn't even know he wanted until a month ago. She leaned her head against his shoulder. It wasn't a calculated move. It was pure, exhaustion-driven surrender. The heavy muscle of his arm tightened around her. Between them, pressed against Dominic's side, Nora's stomach hardened. The baby, agitated by the stress, executed a sharp, forceful roll. Dominic froze. He looked down at the space between them. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his free hand. He looked at Nora, a silent question in his eyes. She didn't pull away. She just nodded, once. Dominic placed his large, calloused hand flat against the side of her stomach, right over the thin silk of her dress. A second later, a tiny, distinct kick tapped directly against his palm. Dominic sucked in a sharp breath. His eyes widened, the hard, slate grey softening into something fractured and raw. He didn't move his hand. He kept it there, waiting. Another kick came, stronger this time. The kingpin of the city's underworld let out a shaky exhale, his thumb brushing gently over the curve of her belly. For a moment, the burning crib, the Morettis, the syndicate, all of it vanished. There was only the quiet room, the ticking clock, and the undeniable proof of life thrumming beneath his palm. "He's strong," Dominic murmured, his voice thick. "She," Nora corrected automatically, her voice a fragile whisper. Dominic looked up at her, his hand still resting on their child. The corners of his mouth twitched, a tiny, barely there crack in his armor. "She," he repeated softly. He pulled Nora slightly closer, resting his jaw against her temple. "I won't let them near her, Nora. I swear it on my life." Nora closed her eyes, letting the scent of rain and cold exhaust wash over her. She was trapped in a fortress, hunted by a cartel and bound to a murderer. But as Dominic's hand stayed anchored to her stomach, protecting the life inside, Nora realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was going to war, and the devil himself was on her side. The morning after the crib burned, the Rousseau estate ceased to be a home. It became a forward operating base. Nora woke to the sound of heavy boots on the hardwood floors upstairs. She lay in the massive bed in the guest suite, staring at the ceiling, feeling the rolling, heavy shifts of the baby under her ribs. She was 25 weeks along now. The fatigue was a constant, leaden weight behind her eyes, but sleep was a luxury the house no longer afforded. She pushed herself up, the joints in her hips popping in quiet protest. She walked to the window. The manicured lawn was gone, replaced by utility vehicles. Men in tactical vests stood by the wrought-iron gates, holding rifles across their chests. The smell of diesel exhaust and old rain seeped through the reinforced glass. There was a knock at the door. Before she could answer, it opened. Dominic stood in the threshold. He wore a dark suit, the jacket unbuttoned, his tie loose. He looked like a man who had spent the night dissecting a map and planning a slaughter. "Pack a bag for Lily," he said. His voice was clipped, devoid of the fragile warmth from the night before in his office. This was the Don. Just essentials. 3 days' worth. Nora's stomach plummeted. "Where is she going?" "A safe house upstate. Maria is taking her." Dominic stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the perimeter by habit, checking the window locks even though they were electronic. The Morettis made a public threat. "I can't have a 4-year-old in the blast radius while I dismantle them." "And me?" Nora asked, her voice tight. Dominic finally looked at her. His grey eyes dropped to the swell of her stomach beneath her silk nightgown, then snapped back to her face. "You stay here, with me. If the house is a target—" "The house is a fortress," he interrupted, closing the distance between them. "Upstate is hidden, but it's not fortified. Lily is small. She can be moved quietly. You can't. You're pregnant with my blood, Nora. If they find you out there, on the road, with a skeleton crew—" He didn't finish the sentence. The implication hung in the air, heavy and metallic. "You stay where I can see you. Where I have 50 men between you and the front door." Nora swallowed hard. She didn't argue. She understood the cold, terrifying logic of it. She was the vault. The vault stays in the strongest room. "I'll pack Lily's things," she said quietly. Dominic nodded. He reached out, his hand hovering for a fraction of a second before he tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. His fingers were cold. "Don't leave the East Wing today. I have capos coming in. It's going to be crowded." By noon, the compound was suffocating. Lily was gone, whisked away in a bulletproof SUV with Maria and 4 armed guards. The silence left in the wake of the child's absence was deafening. Nora paced her room. She tried to read. She tried to sleep. Finally, the claustrophobia won. She needed water. She needed to walk. She slipped out of her suite, wearing a thick, dark maternity dress that brushed her ankles. The hallway was shadowed, the heavy steel shutters still locked over the windows. The house smelled of stale coffee, sweat, and gun oil. As she neared the kitchen, she heard the voices. They were coming from the formal dining room. Nora stopped. The door was ajar. They hit the shipments at the docks, Dominic. 3 crates of pharmaceuticals gone. They're choking our supply lines to bait you out. The voice belonged to Leo, Dominic's underboss. A man with a scarred neck and a voice like a grinding stone. "Let them choke the lines," Dominic's voice replied. It was deadly calm. "I don't care about the shipments. The pills are insured. The territory can wait. They crossed a line. They brought my family into it. With respect, boss, burning a crib is theater," Leo argued. "It's a psychological play. You retaliate too hard on a ghost threat. The commission in New York will step in. They don't want a bloodbath over a scare tactic." "It wasn't a scare tactic, Leo. It was a promise." There was the sound of a fist hitting the heavy oak table. Not a slam, but a definitive, heavy thud. "They know about the girl. They know about the baby." Silence stretched in the dining room. Nora pressed her back against the hallway wall, her hands resting on her stomach. "The nanny?" Leo finally asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You're starting a war over the help?" "She isn't the help," Dominic stated. The absolute authority in his tone made Nora's breath catch. "She is carrying my daughter, which makes her untouchable. You find the Moretti crew running the Southside docks. You don't ask questions. You don't negotiate. You leave them in pieces in the trunks of their own cars. I want Carlo Moretti to understand that the price for looking at my house is his entire infrastructure." "Dominic, the commission! I am the commission in this city!" Dominic roared. The sound vibrated through the floorboards. "You have your orders, Leo. Execute them." Footsteps approached the door. Nora scrambled backward, hurrying toward the kitchen to make it look like she had just arrived. She turned the faucet on just as Leo marched past the kitchen archway, his face dark with fury. A minute later, Dominic walked in. He looked drained. The violent energy of the meeting was bleeding out of him, leaving him looking older, hollowed out. He saw her standing by the sink, a glass of water in her trembling hand. He knew she had heard. He walked over to her, taking the glass from her hand and setting it on the marble counter. He boxed her in against the sink, resting his hands on the counter on either side of her hips. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a heavy blanket. "I told you to stay in the East Wing," he murmured. "I was thirsty," Nora replied, looking up at him. She didn't flinch. 6 months ago, hearing a man order a slaughter would have sent her running for the police. Now, she looked at the bags under Dominic's eyes and felt a terrifying, pragmatic sense of relief. He was going to kill them. He was going to kill them so her daughter could breathe. "You're shaking," he noted, his eyes scanning her face. "I'm adjusting," she said flatly, "to the reality of what this baby means, to what you are." Dominic let out a slow breath. He leaned his forehead against hers. It was an incredibly intimate, exhausted gesture. I am a monster, Nora. I have never pretended otherwise. But I am your monster now, and I will burn this city down before I let anyone touch you." Nora closed her eyes. She leaned into the cold, solid weight of his chest. She was damned. They both were. But in the dark, twisted logic of the cartel, being damned together was the only way to survive. August arrived like an anvil, heavy and suffocating. Nora was 33 weeks pregnant. Her ankles swelled by noon, her back ached in a constant low throb, and the baby rolled and kicked with enough force to make her gasp. The war with the Morettis had gone from cold to boiling. For 2 months, Dominic had waged a brutal, systematic campaign of eradication. Sirens echoed in the distance every night. The local news reported gang violence and unprecedented organized crime casualties. Inside the compound, it was a pressure cooker. Dominic rarely slept. He spent his nights in the office, fielding encrypted calls, directing the violence like a conductor, leading a macabre symphony. It happened on a Thursday. Nora was in the living room, reading a book she couldn't focus on. The air conditioning was humming loudly, fighting the 90-degree heat outside. At 2:14 p.m., the power died. The hum of the AC stopped. The lights cut out. The heavy, pressurized silence of the house suddenly felt fragile. Nora sat up slowly, her hand resting on the arm of the sofa. The backup generators should have kicked in immediately. They didn't. "Dominic!" she called out. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the cavernous room. There was no answer. Just the distant, muffled sound of shouting from the front gates. Then the first gunshot cracked. It wasn't a pistol. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of an automatic rifle. Nora's blood turned to ice. She hauled herself off the sofa, her center of gravity dangerously skewed. She grabbed the edge of the coffee table for balance. The front doors, solid oak and reinforced steel, shook with a massive impact. Someone was using a vehicle as a battering ram. "Nora!" Dominic burst out of the hallway leading to his office. He had a tactical rifle slung over his shoulder and a pistol in his hand. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated violence. "The safe room," he barked, grabbing her arm. "Now!" "The generators." "They hit the main line and the backups with an EMP rig," Dominic grunted, pulling her down the hall toward the basement stairs. "It's a coordinated breach. Carlo sent a suicide squad. Move." They hit the stairs. Nora gasped, her hand clutching the rail. Moving fast was physically impossible. A sharp, tearing pain shot across her lower abdomen, round ligament pain, sharp as a knife. She stumbled. Dominic caught her under the arms, practically lifting her off her feet. He didn't say a word. He carried her weight down the concrete stairs into the subterranean level of the house. The basement was pitch black. Gunfire erupted upstairs, inside the house now. The front doors had breached. The sound of boots tearing across the hardwood floors echoed down the stairwell. "They're inside," Nora whispered, panic suffocating her. "My men will hold the choke point at the foyer," Dominic said, his breathing heavy as he hauled her toward the back of the basement. He reached the solid steel door of the safe room. He bypassed the dead electronic keypad, pulling a heavy, physical key from a chain around his neck. He shoved it into the manual override lock. The heavy deadbolt slammed back. He hauled the door open and pushed Nora inside. "Stay away from the door. Get against the far wall," he ordered, not stepping in with her. Nora turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Dominic, get in!" "I can't lock it from the inside without power. The manual deadbolt has to be thrown from the outside to secure the steel pins." He looked at her. In the dim light filtering from the stairwell, his face was streaked with sweat. "I have to lock you in. I'll hold the basement stairs." "No!" Nora grabbed his shirt, her fingers tangling in the expensive fabric. The terror was absolute. "They'll kill you. You can't leave me in here. What if you don't come back? What if—" "I am coming back," Dominic interrupted, his voice a harsh, desperate rasp. He grabbed her face with both hands. His palms were rough, his grip firm. He pressed his forehead against hers. "I am coming back, I swear to you, Nora. You keep our girl quiet. You keep her safe." He kissed her. It wasn't like the desperate, mechanical collision in the dark 8 months ago. It was bruising, territorial, and completely desperate. A promise sealed in blood and cordite. He pulled back, shoved her gently into the darkness of the safe room, and slammed the heavy steel door. The metallic screech of the exterior deadbolts sliding into place echoed like a gunshot. Then absolute darkness. Nora backed up until her shoulders hit the concrete wall. She slid down to the floor, pulling her knees up as far as her massive belly would allow. She wrapped her arms around her stomach. The safe room was soundproofed, but it wasn't perfect. The vibrations of the war upstairs traveled down the concrete walls. Heavy thuds. The muffled, frantic popping of gunfire. The visceral shudder of something exploding. She sat in the blackness, breathing through the panic. The baby was kicking wildly, reacting to Nora's racing heart and the adrenaline flooding her system. "It's okay," Nora whispered into the dark, rocking slightly, holding her stomach. "He's coming back. Your dad is coming back. He promised." Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe it was only 20 minutes. Time didn't exist in the dark. Only the vibrations. Only the waiting. Slowly the vibrations stopped. The heavy thuds ceased. The silence that followed was worse than the gunfire. It was the silence of a graveyard. Nora held her breath, staring into the pitch blackness toward where she knew the door was. If Dominic was dead, the Morettis would find the room. They would eventually breach the steel. They would finish what they started. A metallic scrape echoed from the other side of the door. Nora shoved her hand into her mouth to muffle a scream. She pressed herself harder into the concrete, bracing for the door to open, bracing for the blinding light of a tactical flashlight and the barrel of a gun. The heavy deadbolts threw back with a violent clack. The door groaned open. A single beam of a flashlight cut through the dark, sweeping the floor before landing on Nora's boots. Nora. The voice was ragged, wet and destroyed, but it was his. Nora sobbed, pushing herself off the floor. Dominic stood in the doorway. The flashlight in his left hand illuminated the ruin of his clothes. His suit jacket was gone. His white shirt was soaked in dark, heavy blood. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his rifle discarded somewhere upstairs. Nora rushed forward, not caring about the blood, not caring about the dark. She crashed into his chest. Dominic dropped the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, rolling to illuminate their feet. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He was shaking. The kingpin of the city, the untouchable Don, was trembling like a leaf. "They're dead," he rasped against her skin. "Carlo, his lieutenants, the squad. They're all dead." Nora clung to him, feeling the sticky warmth of the blood on his shirt transferring to her hands. "Are you hit? Is this yours?" "Only a little," he muttered, pulling back just enough to look at her face in the ambient light of the dropped flashlight. He rested his bloody hand against the side of her stomach. "Are you okay?" "Is she?" "We're fine. We're here." Nora looked at his bruised, blood-streaked face. The cynical voice in her head, the one that had told her to run all those months ago, was finally silent. She didn't want to run anymore. The cleanup took 3 days. The bodies were removed. The hardwood floors were bleached, sanded, and refinished. The shattered windows were replaced with thicker, heavier glass. The compound absorbed the violence and reset itself, a pristine fortress built on a foundation of bones. Lily was brought back from upstate. She ran into the newly repaired living room, entirely oblivious to the blood that had soaked into the Persian rug only 72 hours prior. She just wanted to show Nora a drawing she made of a horse. Nora sat in the armchair, her hands resting heavily on her swollen stomach. She smiled, praising the drawing, while Dominic stood by the fireplace, watching them. His arm was in a sling. A bullet had grazed his bicep during the breach. He looked exhausted, but the frantic, paranoid tension that had gripped him for 2 months was gone. The Morettis were eradicated. The remaining factions in the city had immediately fallen into line, terrified by the sheer, absolute brutality of Dominic's retaliation. He had secured the throne, and he had bathed it in blood to do it. Later that evening, after Maria had put Lily to bed, Nora stood by the reinforced window in the master bedroom. She hadn't gone back to the guest suite after the attack. Dominic hadn't asked her to move. She had simply walked into his room, and he had pulled the covers back for her. She looked out at the floodlights illuminating the perimeter. The guards were still there, patrolling the shadows. They always would be. Dominic walked into the room. He had showered, his wet hair pushed back. He wore soft grey sweatpants, his injured arm resting against his chest. He stopped behind her, not touching her, just sharing the view. "Rossi says you have 3 weeks," Dominic said quietly. "Give or take," Nora replied. The baby shifted low in her pelvis, a heavy, grounding ache. "I bought a property in Switzerland," Dominic said. The words hung in the quiet air. "Under a shell corporation, untraceable. It's a quiet town, mountains, good schools." Nora turned her head, looking at him over her shoulder. "Why?" Dominic looked at her. His slate-grey eyes were clear, stripped of the violent haze. "Because this world is poison, Nora. I grew up in it. I survived it. But you saw what it takes to keep breathing in this house. You saw what I have to do." He reached out with his good hand, lightly touching her hip. "I can put you on a plane tomorrow," he continued, his voice tight. "You, Lily, and the baby. I can set you up. You'll never have to look at a gun again. You'll never have to hear a door get kicked in. You'll be safe." Nora turned fully to face him. The cynical, desperate nanny who had hidden a pregnancy in oversized sweaters was gone. The woman standing in front of him had listened to a war through a steel door. She had washed a rival boss's blood out of her hair. "And you?" she asked. "I stay. I run the syndicate. I keep the target on my back so nobody looks for you." Nora stared at him. He was offering her exactly what she had wanted 5 months ago. An escape. A blank check and a quiet life. She looked around the massive, fortified bedroom. She looked at the man who had torn a city apart to keep a promise. She placed her hand over his where it rested on her hip, interlocking her fingers with his calloused ones. "No." Dominic blinked, visibly thrown. "Nora, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, her voice steady. "I understand that if I leave, you'll hollow out until there's nothing left but the monster. I understand that Lily needs her father. And I understand that my daughter isn't going to grow up hiding in the mountains, pretending her name isn't Russo." Dominic stepped closer, his chest brushing against her stomach. "It's a violent life. Then we make sure we're the ones holding the weapons," Nora said. There was a cold, pragmatic truth in her voice that matched his own. She reached up, her hand gently touching his jaw, feeling the rough stubble. "You told me I was titanium, Dominic. Don't try to wrap me in bubble wrap now." Dominic stared down at her, a slow, profound realization settling over his features. He wasn't looking at a hostage anymore. He wasn't looking at a liability. He was looking at an equal, a queen to sit beside him in the dark. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that was slow, deliberate, and entirely consuming. It wasn't born of adrenaline or panic. It was a seal, an acknowledgement of the twisted, blood-soaked reality they were choosing. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, his good hand sliding around to support the heavy weight of her back. 3 weeks, he murmured against her mouth. Then the princess arrives. God help this city, Nora whispered, a cynical, genuine smile finally touching her lips. God won't, Dominic promised, but I will. The war is won, but the real reign has just begun. Nora went from a desperate nanny, hiding in oversized sweaters, to the untouchable queen of the Russo syndicate, proving that sometimes survival means embracing the dark. What did you think of Nora's ultimate choice to stay in the compound instead of running to Switzerland? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this dark mafia romance and want more intense, grounded storytelling, smash that like button, share the video, and subscribe for more.